may we presume that, and you've just said it was an incredibly difficult task faced by the DHSC,
Yeah.
but by the beginning of March, as you were grappling with the emerging scientific advice as to the state of the transmission of the outbreak, how far it had got, to what extent it had become sustained within the community in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Dealing with the absence of plans and, as you say in your book, having to formulate a battle plan, having to consider for the first time in 100 years some of these extraordinarily stringent countermeasures. The DHSC must have been under very considerable stress. I mean, this was not an obligation that you sought. You were a lead government department responding to a whole government crisis, a whole nation crisis.
Yes.
Was the DHSC under stress? Was it in difficulties at the beginning of March?
We were under enormous stress. We were working incredibly hard, yes.
Could we have 129226, please, which is a text from yourself to Boris Johnson on the 7th of March, page 2. He asks you, anything I can do to help? You're doing great, keep going. And you say, kind of you to say, it's not easy. You're doing great too, follow the science. And you ask for help in relation to, or you invite him to start thinking about how he could contribute to a call for a public effort, a clarion call for hand washing and helping old folks if they have to stay home. It's a great unifying clarion call for you to lead when the time is right. Was that not an opportunity for you to say to the Prime Minister, well, we absolutely have to get on top of the very real difficulties with the absence of real plans for infection control, with the development and implementation of countermeasures, with the incredibly difficult issue of funding and planning for vaccines, shielding, all the other areas that your department was grappling with?
By this point, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Office machine, and Number 10 were wholly engaged. The Prime Minister, I think, chaired the first COBRA on the 2nd of March, and so we'd had almost a week of me being able to say all of that. So I think this was he asked if I could anything I could do to help, and I said we should have a whole national effort. So that pretty much covers all bases.
And Mr. Hancock, you're aware that the very senior civil servant, Helen McNamara, who was at one stage Deputy Cabinet Secretary, described you in evidence as having nuclear levels of confidence, which she thought was a problem. Do you reject the notion that in your dealings with your colleagues, in terms of the impression that you gave, you were overconfident in presenting the undoubtedly extraordinarily difficult issues that your department faced?
It depends who with. I had with, for instance, Chris Wormold, Chris Whitty, about how we were responding. We were in a trusted environment. We were self-critical about how we were responding. That's only natural because we could see what was happening, and we could see that we were in the middle of something that hadn't happened for decades, and it was on our watch, so to speak. It's also, I also thought it was necessary, and I can understand how some people will have interpreted the way that I now know that they did, although I didn't know this at the time because nobody raised any of these issues with me at the time. I can see how, my sense of needing to keep driving the system forward might have had this impact on some people, who, especially those who were more sceptical of the need of the government to act, frankly. We have seen some of the evidence that the same people who are accusing me of overconfidence at the same time we're blocking the action that I was saying we needed. And so I can now see the dynamics of if they were against action being taken, and I was going in and saying we absolutely must do this, and there was a huge amount of uncertainty and a huge amount of worry, and I basically felt it was my professional duty to try to keep going, to keep driving forward.
Who was against action being taken?
Well, I don't want to point fingers because everybody was doing their best.
Which government department significantly was against action being taken?
Well, for instance, the reluctance to get the Cobra machine going. We've seen some of the evidence of certain individuals thinking that we were overreacting or the world had gone mad. There was a delay, an inexplicable delay at the centre to the publication of the action plan, which came on the 3rd, and we've seen some evidence of why that happened. So there's various examples of it, but I basically felt that I had to drive this thing forward, and I felt that sense of responsibility. Of course, and of course, I understand that now that some people, reacted in the way that they did, but it was. But it was a time of enormous uncertainty and a time when I just felt we needed to keep driving this system forward.
We will look at some of the areas, and indeed, in fact, all the areas that you've identified, Mr. Hancock, where there may have been evidence of the government machine being delayed or of action not being taken when it could reasonably have been taken. May the inquiry presume and conclude from what you've said about the difficulties in getting the government machine going, that there were these instances of people pushing back or not doing perhaps what they should have done, that by and large there was overall, therefore, an avoidable delay.
Well,
between the beginning of February, and we'll look now at the material that was available to you and to the machine, and the lockdown decision of the 23rd of March. It just didn't have to have been that long.
Can I answer that question contemporaneously and then with hindsight? Contemporaneously, people were doing their jobs to the best of their ability. The Cabinet Secretary had a reason for not wanting to call a Cobra unnecessarily, and it took 48 hours to persuade him, and that was because he thought they were overused previously. He was worried that it was for use for communications purposes. I did not want it for communications purposes. I wanted it for substantive reasons to get the government machine moving. People had good reasons at the time, and maybe because they weren't faced like I was with the daily evidence of this growing crisis. They simply didn't cotton on to the fact that this enormous wave was coming. So I don't think it's fair to criticise people for making professional judgments at the time. With hindsight, knowing what we know now, it's obvious to everybody that there should have been a whole of government response from earlier, but you've got to remember the fog of uncertainty and the lack of data. And there weren't cases in the UK till the end of January. The first death in the UK, very sadly, in the UK was on the 1st of March. So this was very, very early on.
You have described, Mr. Hancock, how you saw the government machine trying to ramp itself up. You could see the difficulties that on your evidence, the department and yourself encountered. You've given evidence about the instances in which people push back or where there may have been a failure to act reasonably speedily. So you must have been aware, you were the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, that things were not being progressed as you, in your own words, would have wished. So you must have been aware of the delay.
Yes.
I don't. The inquiry has no interest in you trying to, and rightly so, not identify individuals to blame. But you must have been aware that cross-government, systemically, the United Kingdom government was failing to respond sufficiently, speedily and well in this crisis. It's not a matter of hindsight. You could see it happening at the time.
Well, I found frustrations in areas I wanted to push forward at the time. The evidence I'm giving is that now, having seen it from the inside, in many cases, people had reasonable arguments for why they were doing that. They were behaving professionally. There was, of course, also this very unpleasant, toxic culture. But I think that became a problem later rather than early on. I think it was just reasonable people doing their jobs, saying, really? There are known costs to the things that I was trying to do and unknown benefits, because at this point it might still have all been contained within China. So people saying, are you sure you want to do this? Do we really want to tell the public we might shut down whole cities? Well, yes, I did want to do that. But I can I'm just trying to empathise with why people reacted the way that they did at the time.
Now, you've mentioned plans, and the lack of planning is an important part of the inquiry's examination of this area. In your statement, and you've acknowledged it already, you observe that there was no book or report to pull off a shelf to tell us how to handle a pandemic. But in a WhatsApp message from you to Mr. Cummings on the 12th of March, can we have 48313, page 68? In the context, Mr. Hancock, to put this in its correct context, watching Question Time, we need to up gear on winning the public argument. So it's in the context of the debate that was then rumbling on, in fact, about reasonable worst-case scenario, herd immunity, behavioural fatigue, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
You say we are better prepared than other countries. By the 12th of March, you were surely aware that we were not better prepared than other countries. There was, and you've acknowledged it already, a complete understanding that there was no scaled-up test, trace, isolate, contact isolate system beyond the first few hundred cases. There was no effective means of infection control. There was no border plans or quarantine system in place. You knew there was sustained community transmission in the United Kingdom by this date, and you knew that the infection fatality rate was 1%. 1% of all infected people would die. Why did you say we are better prepared than other countries?
Well, I think there's two ways to answer that question. The first is this is about a communications question, and the 12th of March was the end of the period in which we were concerned about the timing of lockdown and making sure that we didn't go too early. And I changed my view on that on the 13th.
Can I which being polite, just interrupt you there to say, is that a reference to the debate which rumbled on, in fact, for quite some time, about the risk of going too early in terms of any countermeasures that might be implied?
Yes, and for instance, I look back on the interview I gave on Sunday morning of the 1st of March, when I said, of course, there's a risk of going too early, and the interviewer said, yes, well, of course, we all understand that. So this was a widely shared belief that, in hindsight, was wrong, because our doctrine was wrong, as we discussed in the first module. And so this is a comms recommendation to the guy responsible for comms in number 10. As it happened, what I think this actually shows is the end of the road for this argument. This argument that we didn't need to move, we should wait, it was better to wait. This argument came to its end essentially at this point.
The point about it being a communications debate is well made. You're obviously being asked in the context of watching Question Time.
Yeah.
But your evidence so far, Mr. Hancock, has been very much the effect of the DHSC was a siren voice calling for more to be done, for trying to push the government machine on. But by the 12th of March, as you knew very well, the United Kingdom government had reached the end, even by that late stage, of the containment phase of the strategy. The virus was rife. Should you not have been taking this opportunity to tell your colleagues in government, telling the public, telling the citizens of this nation this wall of death is coming, and we have no effective means to deal with it other than to impose infection control measures urgently and significantly?
Well, in my public communications, you will know that I had at that point been explaining that we might have to do that, yes. But I'm also a team player, and the government position was not yet. So this was a message about how to best explain the government position of not yet. But as I say, the position of not yet was running to the end of its road, and it was on the very next day that I first told the Prime Minister that I thought that we needed to lock down.
Was that the 13th of March?
Correct.
It's not in your diary, so-called, I should say, Mr. Hancock. The entry for the 13th of March makes no reference to you telling the Prime Minister this vital piece of information that he should lock down immediately. There is a whole page on how you woke up for the dawn flight to Belfast in Edinburgh Airport.
Yeah.
There was, from the Prime Ministerial meeting, Prime Ministerial papers, a video call, 9:30 that morning, and according to your book, you say, I called the Prime Minister and told him we'd have to do some very rapid backpedaling on the issue of herd immunity.
Yeah.
Then rang Patrick, who promised to do his best to repair the damage.
Yeah.
You then met with First Minister in Belfast. You then went to Cardiff, and so on.
Yes.
Telling the Prime Minister of this country for the first time that he had to call an immediate lockdown is surely worthy of some recollection, is it not?
I didn't have full access to my papers for writing of that, and this came to light in researching the papers ahead of this inquiry. This is, after all, the formal public inquiry. What then happened is that was on the 13th, which was the Friday. On the 14th, we then had formal meetings in the cabinet room on this subject, and I again made my views very clear. But if you this shift from we should wait because we've got to get the timing right to we must act now happened quickly. So, for instance, on the 13th of March, there was a G7 call with my, and I was very struck, especially by my Italian opposite number, because they had put in place the lockdown across the whole of Italy by then, and he was describing where they were up to, and it was harrowing.
Forgive me. Your book says the account that follows has been meticulously pieced together from my formal papers, notes, voice memos, my communications, WhatsApps, we know from the press, and it records in 555 pages all the relevant, important events as you saw it concerning the coronavirus response. But there is no reference to you telling the Prime Minister to call for an immediate lockdown on the 13th of March. And you know that there are no notes and no emails in the inquiry's possession, because we've given them to you, that records that conversation. So I am required to ask you, how sure are you that you told the Prime Minister that he had to call for an immediate lockdown in a call on the 13th of March?
I can remember it, and it came to light in looking forward to this inquiry. And what's more, the corroborating evidence, if you like, is that it happened. It is recorded that on the 14th, which was the Saturday, there was significant discussions in number 10, at which I made this case again.
All right. Could we have 48313, page 5, please, on the screen? This is a WhatsApp message between you and Mr. Cummings a bit earlier, Mr. Hancock, on the 23rd of January. Evidence has been given to this inquiry by Mr. Cummings that he WhatsApped you, as we can see there, to ask you to what extent have you investigated preparations for something terrible like Ebola or a flu pandemic. Yes, you say, we have full plans,
Yeah.
plural, up to and including pandemic levels, regularly prepped and refreshed.
Yeah.
So just pausing there, that may give the impression that whatever plans they were, and however deficient or effective they were, they had been recently, because of the word refreshed, prepped and brought up to date.
Yeah.
Very fairly, you accept in your book and in your statement that the only plan that there was a strategy plan from 2011 in the field of central government response to a pandemic, not NHS surge capacity or beds, but the central government response to a pandemic. There was the 2011 strategy.
Yeah.
A single document based doctrinally on a completely inappropriate approach.
Yeah. This is what I thought at the time, as you
But
can
who
see.
told you that?
Public Health England, the World Health Organization.
Well, just pause there. The World Health Organization
Yes.
doesn't, of course, hold the book for the United Kingdom plans.
No, but it did analysis on which countries are the best prepared, and we were the second overall. So all I can tell you is what I thought at the time. It's not what I think now.
You wouldn't, as the Secretary of State, phoned up the World Health Organization and said, what are our plans? You would have made inquiries in your department.
Yes.
When you made those inquiries, what plans are there?
Yes.
What information, what description of those plans were you given?
Well, it was essentially the output of the Cygnus exercise, the fact that we had legislative plans available if necessary. We had both the legislative vehicle of the 1984 Public Health Act, and we had the draft bill, which by then I will have known about. We had plans to get testing up and running within PHE. Now, that obviously happened far too slowly thereafter. But remember, at this point, PHE had performed extremely well in the early couple of weeks of the pandemic by developing a test within 3 days of receiving the data from China. We had, by then, in the department already discussed the vaccine, and we knew that we had a vaccine platform that had been funded in order to respond to Ebola that had the potential to be used in response to this new virus at Oxford University. With hindsight, it would have been far better if I'd said, I do know about this, I really need your help. The plans that we've got aren't up to it. But that wasn't what I thought, what I was being told at the time.
You're the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care.
Yeah.
The country is facing an unknown but extremely serious pathogenic outbreak on the 23rd of January. Nobody knows how far it's going to spread at that stage, but you plainly need to know what the plans are. My question was put to you to elicit what your understanding was from your staff and your advisors and your officials of the government's central infection control plans.
Yes.
Prosaically, do we shut schools?
Yes.
Do we quarantine people? Do we have hand washing? Do we self-isolate? If so, for how long, and whether is it individually or is it for a household? Those sorts of issues. So not pandemic bill proposals.
Why not?
Well,
It's important as well.
Mr. Hancock, because that is not the question I've asked you. I want to know about what your understanding was of the state of play of the countermeasures. That's to say, the infection control measures, not vaccine proposals or Cygnus reports, which didn't deal, of course, with countermeasures, or legislative proposals, but prosaically, how, as a country, are we going to stop the virus from spreading if it comes?
There's a number of things in your question I need to correct. Cygnus was involved with legislative proposals.
I suggested it wasn't involved with proposals for countermeasures. It didn't propose particular countermeasures in its recommendations.
The Cygnus was, contrary to your initial question, involved in legislative proposals. Furthermore, legislative proposals are countermeasures because you can't isolate people against their will without legislation. So this attempt in the questioning to split off different parts of the overall response is false. That's why I'm responding in the way that I am to your question. The premise of the question was wrong. The reason that I held this confident view at that point is because, for instance, the Global Health Security Index in 2019 said that we were the second best country prepared in the world after the US, and that we were the best in the world in the subcategory of rapid response to and mitigation of the spread of an epidemic. The WHO said the UK remains amongst the leaders worldwide in preparing for a pandemic. This all turned out not to be true, but it is what I was being told at the time.
All right. On the 6th of February 2020, there was a cabinet meeting, Mr. Hancock. 56137, page 6. Concluding, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care said he was grateful for the support of his ministerial colleagues. There were 2 cases in the United Kingdom. They were, of course, as you've correctly identified, on the 30th and 31st of January. And there would almost certainly be more. The approach to tackling the virus in the United Kingdom to date had been medic-led. The central point, according to these minutes, Mr. Hancock, that you then make is that the government had a plan to deal with this illness.
Yes.
You didn't, in fact, within the Department of Health and Social Care, commission until the 10th of February the plan, the battle plan as you describe it in your statement, or the action plan as it was published on the 3rd of March. And therefore, what plan was it that you were referring your cabinet colleagues to deal with the illness?
Well, firstly, we had the pandemic flu strategy set out in 2011. But by this point, we had a whole series of different plans for expanding different areas. So we had a plan for the expansion of testing within PHE. Now, that plan did not go fast enough, and I had to take serious action to change that in the middle of March. We had a plan for the development of a vaccine, and we'd already put extra funds into the development of a vaccine by this point. We had a whole series of plans. In a number of questions, you've said there was an absence of a plan. That is not true. There was a plan. In fact, there was a plan with detail on a whole different series of areas. My critique of the plan is that it was not an adequate plan in doctrine or in level of detail, and it's absolutely incumbent on this inquiry to get to the substance of what the future plan should be, and it's that substance that really matters. So we had a plan. It was guided by the science. By this point, I was much more worried that on the 23rd of January, and really it was over the last week of January that my worry levels changed categorically because we saw the reasonable worst-case scenario, and I remember that meeting very vividly. That was at the end of January. You'll also notice in here that I said in the reasonable worst-case scenario, we'd see almost every government department affected. Well, that was an understatement. I shouldn't have said almost. And that colleagues should attend personally or designate a junior minister who was dedicated to this task. Dedicated. So this is clearly me saying to the rest of my cabinet colleagues, we're all going to have to get stuck in on this. And yes, we did have a plan. It is entirely reasonable for me to both explain that we had a plan, indeed plans in place, but also critique for the future where those plans were flawed.
One further question on this topic, please, Mr. Hancock. On the 14th of February 2020, so a week or so later, we needn't put the document up, but at page 7 of the Cabinet minutes, or the note of the meeting, again, your Cabinet colleagues are told the government had a plan informed by science.
Yes.
Helen McNamara has given evidence to the effect through her witness statement that time and time again, Cabinet was assured that, quote, we had plans in place. You have described the vaccine preparation work. what was done, and we'll come to the detail of it in due course, what was done by way of testing. But so that we can clearly understand your response, are you saying that there was, throughout February, already in place a plan for countermeasures, that is to say, infection control measures, the sorts of measures which were ultimately put into place on the 12th of March, the 16th of March, the 20th of March, and the 23rd of March?
I'm so sorry. We didn't put measures into place on the 12th of March.
12th of March was the first day on which measures were put into place. You'll recall it was the order for symptomatic individuals to isolate for 7 days.
The measures that were put in place were much more stringent than had been envisaged in the original plan.
Could you please just answer the question? Were there, as far as you understood it, on the advice of your advisors and your colleagues, plans for countermeasures, for infection control measures in existence and informed to the Cabinet in February 2020?
There was a plan as set out and based on the 2011 pandemic flu plan, updated with the conclusions of Cygnus. And in Module 1, we discussed at length the flaws in that plan. The argument there wasn't a plan is false. Indeed, I've heard a number of Cabinet Office figures argue that there wasn't a plan. If you look at the 28th of February submission to the Prime Minister by CCS, it sets out that we have very advanced plans. In fact, it is much too bullish and self-confident, that note. And the idea that it was wrong to suggest that we had a plan is completely false. I appreciate that some people in the Cabinet Office did then later catch up with the seriousness of the situation and become rather alarmed. I think that their reaction when they finally woke up, in some cases, was helpful because the machine ground into action. In some cases, it was not particularly helpful because it would have been better if they'd said, we now realise there's a problem, what have you been doing about it, as opposed to the toxic blame culture that we've seen and referred to already.
Milady, I'm coming to a completely different subject. Would you like to have a break then, or would you like me to trundle on?
No. I shall return at 20 past.